The Hollywood of the 1950s and 1960s was burning with creative energy. Filmmakers were tearing up the rulebook, studios were wagering their entire futures on individual pictures, and performers were transforming the very definition of what it meant to act on screen. Several of these productions pushed their casts and crews to the edge of survival. A handful drove the studios financing them to the brink of financial collapse. One unleashed a real-world controversy so seismic that the Vatican itself felt compelled to speak out. These are not simply vintage films gathering dust on forgotten shelves. They are the foundational blueprints that virtually every working filmmaker today continues to draw from, whether they admit it or not. Here is the countdown. Coming in at number 15. Singin' in the Rain from 1952. This is not simply a musical. It stands as the most exuberant and quietly cutting satire of Hollywood self-importance ever preserved on film. Gene Kelly portrays a celebrated star of the silent era whose entire world is upended by the arrival of sound cinema, while the actress beside him, brought to life by Jean Hagen, possesses a speaking voice capable of curdling milk. The picture dissects the vanity of the film industry with such pinpoint accuracy that genuine studio executives reportedly shifted uncomfortably in their seats during the very first screening. What unfolded behind the camera was genuinely punishing. Kelly devised and executed that now legendary sequence dancing through a downpour while his body temperature hovered at 103 degrees. The studio brass pushed to eliminate the number entirely, dismissing it as excessive and indulgent. Kelly stood firm. Director Stanley Donen waged a sustained campaign against the executives, week after relentless week, to preserve the satirical spine of the whole production. When it opened, reviewers largely dismissed it as agreeable but slight entertainment, nothing more. Audiences saw something else entirely and rewarded its wit and spectacle with strong box office returns, with the film pulling in well over $7 million. And its reputation climbed with every passing decade. The American Film Institute today places it among the 5 greatest American films ever produced. Steven Spielberg has described it as the single picture he returns to whenever he needs to reconnect with the fundamental reason cinema exists. Quite a legacy for a film the people funding it nearly killed before it could reach an audience. At number 14. Rear Window from 1954. This is not simply a murder mystery. It is Alfred Hitchcock dismantling the entire premise of cinema and implicating every person watching in something deeply uncomfortable before they even register what has happened to them. James Stewart portrays a news photographer immobilized in a wheelchair, who becomes gradually convinced that he has watched a killing take place through the windows of the apartment building facing his own. To bring this vision to life, Hitchcock commissioned the most intricate interior set Paramount Studios had assembled up to that moment, a complete residential courtyard housing 31 fully furnished apartments, with functioning water systems and real electrical wiring running throughout. Through the scorching summer production schedule, temperatures inside the soundstage climbed past 100 degrees on a regular basis, sending crew members to the floor. Stewart's character was conceived with deliberate moral ambiguity, a man who spies on his neighbors continuously while wrapped in the warm familiar image of the American everyman. Reviewers responded with immediate recognition of something special being achieved. Time magazine went so far as to crown it the second most entertaining motion picture ever made. On a production budget of $1 million, it returned more than $5 million at the box office. Brian De Palma built the engine of his entire directorial career from the components Hitchcock assembled here. Films including The Truman Show, American Beauty, and Enemy of the State each carry its fingerprints. The French director François Truffaut may have articulated its significance most precisely when he observed that Rear Window transcends the thriller category entirely and functions instead as a meditation on cinema itself, on the act of watching, on the stories we construct from other lives, and on the ethical weight that comes with doing so. Number 13. On the Waterfront from 1954. Marlon Brando does not simply perform in this picture. He tears apart every existing understanding of what film acting can be and rebuilds it from the foundation. Cast as Terry Malloy, a former prizefighter reduced to working the docks who finds himself present at a union-sanctioned murder, Brando brought a quality to the screen so unfiltered and so physically inhabited that it permanently redirected every serious dramatic performance that came after it. The conditions surrounding the production were genuinely treacherous. Writer Bud Schulberg had constructed his characters from the lives of real waterfront criminals, and threats against the lives of crew members arrived during the shooting period. Brando wore protective armor beneath his clothing at certain locations. Camera operators were forced to conceal their equipment in multiple situations because figures connected to organized crime within the unions were monitoring the production continuously. Director Elia Kazan had months earlier provided names to the House Un-American Activities Committee, and widespread opinion held that every frame of this film served as his public defense of that decision, embedding the entire work in a political controversy impossible to separate from the drama on screen. The critical response was overwhelming. The New York Times declared it the most visceral and affecting portrait of waterfront existence ever captured on film. At the Academy Awards it dominated proceedings, collecting 8 trophies including the prizes for Best Picture, Director, and Leading Actor. Martin Scorsese and Francis Ford Coppola each identify it as the bedrock on which their entire working lives were constructed. Its reach extended far beyond any cinema screen. The picture directly contributed to real governmental scrutiny of dock union practices and produced tangible changes in the actual lives of people working actual waterfronts. That goes well beyond filmmaking. Number 12. Sunset Boulevard from 1950. This is not simply a story set in Hollywood. It is the film industry pointing the camera directly at the rot concealed beneath its own glamorous exterior and refusing to cut away. Gloria Swanson plays Norma Desmond, a silent film actress long forgotten by the public, who exists in an elaborate fantasy inside her deteriorating estate while a young screenwriter desperate for work gradually becomes her captive. The chances director Billy Wilder took were so provocative that the head of MGM, upon watching the completed film, reportedly launched into a screaming confrontation with Wilder, telling him he had brought shame upon the very industry responsible for his career and deserved to be driven out of the city. Swanson herself had genuinely been a major figure in silent cinema, so the portrait she was painting carried an autobiographical weight that gave the entire production a disturbing double quality that unsettles viewers to this day. The film's very first image, that of the narrator recounting his own story while his corpse floats face down in a swimming pool, had no precedent in mainstream cinema before this moment. A considerable number of prominent actresses refused to consider the leading role, fearing the damage association with such a character might inflict on their public standing. When critics encountered the finished film, they were visibly shaken. The Hollywood Reporter described it as a commanding demonstration of the macabre. It collected 11 Academy Award nominations and produced lines of dialogue that became permanently embedded in the cultural vocabulary. David Lynch has stated openly that his complete body of work, most directly Mulholland Drive, lives inside the long shadow cast by what Wilder constructed here. No other film produced before or since has examined the hidden mechanisms of Hollywood with equivalent precision. Number 11. A Streetcar Named Desire from 1951. This is not simply a filmed stage production. It is among the most scorching and unsparing examinations of longing, cruelty, and the destruction of illusion that the cinema has ever produced. Marlon Brando and Vivien Leigh collide in a sustained confrontation between primal force and collapsing refinement, and the damage is visible on both of them by the final frame. Elia Kazan, who had directed the original Broadway production, engaged in fierce and exhausting battles to protect the film's psychological rawness from a censorship apparatus that generated demands for nearly 30 separate alterations. The fights were relentless and brutal. Leigh underwent a genuine psychological crisis during production that tracked so closely alongside her character's mental disintegration that the line between performer and role effectively disappeared. Brando's physical presence on set was so overwhelming that studio representatives expressed genuine concern for the well-being of other people in the cast. Reviewers understood immediately the magnitude of what they were watching. The New York Times described the result as a masterwork of writing, performance, and direction. The film received 12 nominations at the Academy Awards. Acting instructors and coaches across the world continue to hold up Brando's work in this film as the defining standard against which all screen performance should be measured. This production did not simply transfer a great piece of theater to a new medium. It permanently expanded the boundaries of what dramatic storytelling in any form was permitted to explore. Number 10. Some Like It Hot from 1959. This is not simply a comedy. It is the most meticulously engineered farce that American cinema has ever produced, and it landed in a cultural climate that was genuinely unprepared for the ground it was willing to cover. Two jazz musicians who accidentally witness a mob execution are forced to disguise themselves as women and join a touring all-female band to survive, while Marilyn Monroe gives a comedic performance of such disarming and instinctive brilliance that it came close to eclipsing everything constructed around her. Director Billy Wilder spent the production locked in a grinding struggle with Monroe's persistent lateness and fragile psychological state, with one particular line requiring in excess of 50 separate attempts before she delivered it to his satisfaction, burning through time and money at a rate that kept the entire production under unbearable tension. The famous final line of the film, destined to become one of the most quoted conclusions in cinema history, was conceived almost as a throwaway and deliberately left without any conventional resolution. Censorship authorities in several states moved to prohibit the film from being shown. Audiences treated every prohibition as an advertisement and turned up in enormous numbers. The picture generated over $25 million and held the record as the most commercially successful comedy of its time. The American Film Institute has ranked it as the greatest comedy the form has ever produced. When pressed on the film's willingness to transgress accepted norms, Wilder offered the observation that certain audiences simply lack the capacity to appreciate a good joke. Number 9. Ben-Hur from 1959. This is not simply a large-scale historical picture. It is the production that brought MGM to the threshold of extinction and then, at the last possible moment, pulled the studio back from the edge. Charlton Heston carries the film as Judah Ben-Hur, a Jewish aristocrat sold into slavery after being betrayed by his closest Roman friend, who eventually rises to claim both vengeance and something resembling peace. The chariot race at the film center was a production undertaking on a scale almost impossible to comprehend, consuming $4 million by itself, mobilizing 15,000 supporting players, demanding months of specialized training for 82 horses, and requiring 5 continuous weeks of principal photography to yield 9 minutes of finished footage. When a performer was nearly thrown to his death from a racing vehicle during production, director William Wyler chose to keep the cameras recording and worked the near fatality into the final cut. The studio had committed $15 million to this single production, the largest sum ever allocated to a motion picture at that point in history. The consequences of failure would have been institutional death. Instead, the film collected $90 million across world markets and won 11 Academy Awards, a total that went unequaled for nearly 4 decades. Ridley Scott has consistently identified it as the dominant influence on his production of Gladiator. Roger Ebert wrote that the film possesses a scale and an ambition that virtually no other picture even attempts to approach. Quite a result for a production that nearly erased the studio that made it. Number 8. North by Northwest from 1959. This is not simply an espionage thriller. It represents Hitchcock operating at the precise peak of his technical and creative command, constructing sequences of tension and